Hello, and welcome to the BrainTrain channel. Have you ever wondered why there are suburbs surrounding almost every dense city? Why are they there? How did they get there? And whose idea was it anyway? How did countries like the United States manage to pull off suburbanization? These are a lot of great questions. Let's take a look. Let's start off with the definition. Suburbanization is the growth of areas on the outskirts of cities. Many of those who live in this area tend to work in the inner city, while others stay at home and use the technological advances to work right from the suburbs. Some of these individuals take advantage of what is known as telecommuting to work right from their home. Many of us who live in the suburbs and work in the city have to commute via automobile or some other form of mass transit, and many would argue that that's not so great for our environment. Pollution and global warming? That's for another video. Okay, so what's so great about the suburbs? Well, first of all, the suburbs have low density development, whereas urban areas have very high density development. There are a lot more people living per unit area in the urban areas than there are in the suburbs. Second, families were able to own their own homes that were detached from each other, allowing for a considerable amount of their own privacy. Third, we see land being divided up by the use of zoning. This is a good thing because it keeps residential, commercial, and industrial all separate from each other. Fourth, we see a lot of architectural similarity in the suburbs. This similarity in suburban home design makes it much easier to mass produce homes in the suburbs, and it makes it very affordable for the consumers who want to buy those homes. Fifth, we see many available homes opening up in the suburbs, and the farther away you go from the city, the cheaper the land is to buy these homes. This concept of moving farther and farther away from the city is known as leapfrog development. We also see a lot of racial and economic homogenization. Essentially what that means is we see a lot of separation between different income groups and different racial groups. For example, if a particular suburb has a rather high cost of living, you're only going to get people who can afford it living there. Often these areas have a higher concentration of Caucasian Americans, while urban areas have a higher concentration of minority groups. So now let's bring in some historical context so that we can see why the suburbs are the way they are today. The earliest suburbs can be dated back as early as the 1500s. These smaller suburbs were often smaller towns surrounding a larger town that often had a wall surrounding them. These centralized larger towns are often referred to as market towns, and they provided a marketplace for the smaller towns that surrounded them. Throughout the 1800s, European countries went through an industrial revolution which allowed for the advanced technology that we have today. This advanced technology made it possible to build the unique infrastructure that we see today. The infrastructure that played the biggest role in suburbanization would go to transportation technology. That would include railways, streetcar systems, and the highways for our automobiles of today. During the late 1800s, early 1900s, an elect few were able to use railway technology to move out of the urban areas and into these newly suburban areas. This was mainly a small percentage of the upper class, and this is where we see the origins of modern suburbs arrive. These areas were primarily residential, and later they were coined the term bedroom communities. After World War II, we see a mass amount of suburbanization. Homes were being produced in mass quantities, almost 30 a day, which may not seem like a whole lot today, but at the time, it was a lot. Buying a home became very easy, and there were only about 6 to choose from. These mass-produced homes were organized into big neighborhoods that are sometimes called levee towns. The suburbs became a place to live for the middle class and the working class, whereas before it was only an area for the elite few. So, with veterans returning home from war, there was a huge demand for housing. The explosive economy allowed for new building technologies to emerge. Almost everyone owned an automobile. Large freeway networks were being built to support this new growing population, which, by the way, was essential for the growing economy. And of course, the federal government played a pretty big role in funding these projects. So yeah. There's the American dream for you. Now, post-World War II suburbs were still mainly residential, and we don't really see much of that change until more recently. From somewhere around the 80s to the present, we see a huge shift. Remember how we talked about zoning before? Yeah, that's where this comes into play. First, we see a lot of retail stores starting to be added, and then following retail, we start to see offices and industries starting to pop up. These were usually high-tech industries which attracted, on average, a higher educated workforce in the suburbs. And this is where the urban realms model comes into play. Looking at the urban realms model, we can see the urban city in the center, also known as the central business district, and then on the outskirts we see the suburban sectors, also known as edge cities. These edge cities, which is what we see today, are essentially independent of the inner city. It's even gotten to the point where traffic congestion and job growth is now more intense in the suburbs than it is in the inner city. For example, there is a huge construction project on US 31 right next to where I live in Westfield. It makes it kind of difficult to get around. But when it's done, there will be much less congestion and the largely growing population will be able to easily get in and out of the inner city. As I mentioned before, with the ongoing advancement of technology, we now see a lot more telecommuting. Telecommuting is something we see a lot more of as we move forward in time. In the modern suburbs, working at home is an easy thing to do right off of your laptop. And with the advancements of communication technology, this becomes something that anybody can do. Okay, so is suburbanization a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there are a lot of good things that come out of suburbanization. Families are able to have their own private homes. Housing is often cheaper and much more available. You don't have to deal with the craziness of the inner city, like I know how awful it is to find parking in the city. You don't get that with the suburbs. It's great for the economy. And with modern suburbs, we're able to do everything independent from the inner city. You live there, you shop there, you work there, you essentially can do everything there. There are also a lot of negatives though. With the way the suburbs are set up, almost everybody in the suburbs are completely dependent on automobiles. Without a car, you really can't do anything. And with more and more people using automobiles to get to work, there is a lot more greenhouse pollution in our environment. Suburbanization is also very land intensive. The excess use of pavement to build roads, parking lots, and cul-de-sacs are really taking over the natural earth. So if we asked the planet whether or not suburbanization was a good thing, it'd probably say no. As I mentioned before, we also see a pretty big divide between income groups and racial groups, which can cause a lot of problems. Some would say that the suburbs have had an impact on individuals isolating themselves from the community. There are negatives and there are positives, but will we ever reach a point where we get rid of the negatives and only have positives left? Is suburbanization a good thing? I'll let you decide. Thanks for watching.